Good morning. As you've heard, my name is Reverend Mary Margaret Earl, and I'm the Executive Director and Senior Minister of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry in Roxbury. And it's good to be here with you this morning. Good to be with First Parish in Cambridge, a congregation dear to my heart, because it was this congregation that ordained me as a Unitarian Universalist minister 17 years ago. Thank you to the delegate representing First Parish in Cambridge with the urban ministry, Christian Geisy, for reaching out to welcome me here this morning. It's been a number of years since I've preached in Cambridge, and it's good to be back, although I wish I was back in your beautiful pulpit, and perhaps someday in the future I'll return to that beautiful sacred space again. First Parish Cambridge is a member congregation of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, and so it's good to be here this morning to talk to you more about the work that you are a part of. And I'll begin this morning with a story. And it's a story of the exact moment that I knew that I had been shaped by racism. I was 18 years old, playing soccer in gym class my first semester in college, and I tore down the field with drive and purpose and kicked the ball hard toward the goal, right into the shins of an opposing player. And my fierceness turned in a flash into fear, not because I had hit the shins of an opposing player, that was common, but because my opponent, also a college student, was Black. And I feared her reaction. I skidded to a stop, apologized profusely, my fierceness evaporating into the thin air. And she, who I did not know, she, the most soft-spoken of women, said, "Oh, it's fine. Don't worry, it's fine." And it was that split second of fear colliding with gentleness, the upending of my reaction by her soft kindness that jogged loose what I had not seen in myself and was forced to see. My reaction was racist. I feared her and her response to my drive to the shins because she was Black. I'd been shaped by racism, and I didn't know how that had happened. I grew up in an overwhelmingly white farming community in upstate New York. My sports teams were white, my 4-H club, my friends, my neighbors. I didn't see Black people, and I thought racism had been settled in the 1960s. So how had it happened, this fear? The gift of that confusing moment was that I glimpsed that I had absorbed racism without knowing it. We're shaped by stories and untruths that are rendered nearly invisible, and by a history that's been covered over. Our biases form through a million images in the movies or on TV, like the gradual building up of a sand castle, one handful of sand at a time. These shape our inner landscape. Our outer landscape has been shaped by racism too, by policies that are paired with that bias. Courts and schools, where we live and who else does not live there. Despite all of it, for white people, it's easy not to see it and to ignore it. And so the question is, what is asked of us then as people of faith? How do we bring into focus something that is so easily blurred over? In 2021, the UU Urban Ministry embraced a new mission statement, which calls us to work across race and place to dismantle racism and white supremacy culture and to advance racial, social, and economic justice. It's a call that inspires, but it's also daunting. How do we do that? So to back up for a moment, the Urban Ministry, for those of you who are less familiar with us, is a 190-year-old organization now based in Roxbury, the historic heart of Boston's Black community. We're grounded in our UU faith values, and we're encircled by UU member congregations like First Parish in Cambridge and those in Weston, Wayland, Concord, Lexington. We've done many things through our history. Today, we provide programming and services for trauma survivors, after-school programming for Boston high school students, and cultural engagement in the Roxbury neighborhood we serve. We're embarking now on a mission that will call us to do even more, to do more to directly confront the racism that means that the average Roxbury resident lives 30 years less than a resident of White Back Bay just 1 mile away. That means that Black college students leave before graduation at much higher rates than their white counterparts. The legacy that means that the household wealth of white Bostonians exponentially outstrips that of Black Bostonians. Our new mission statement will call for new strategies and programs to confront this legacy. And it will take a deeper commitment from our member congregations like First Parish Cambridge. And so I'm here asking for your help to live into that mission, because it's going to take all of us and also all of us, our heads, our hands, and our hearts to do this work. Our heads help us learn the history of race in the United States. The African-American author James Baldwin said this: history, as nearly no one seems to know, is not merely something to be read, and it does not refer merely or even principally to the past. On the contrary, the great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it in many ways, and history is literally present in all we do, end quote. We are called to learn that history. The African-American attorney and activist Bryan Stevenson, graduate of Harvard, tells the story of sitting in a courtroom as a defense attorney. He said, "The judge and the prosecutor entered through a door in the back of the courtroom laughing and chatting. When the judge saw me sitting at the defense table, he said to me harshly, 'Hey, you shouldn't be in here without counsel. Go back outside and wait in the hallway until your lawyer arrives.' I stood up and smiled broadly and said, 'I'm sorry, Your Honor. We haven't met. My name is Bryan Stevenson. I'm the lawyer on the case set for hearing this morning.' The judge laughed at his mistake and the prosecutor joined in, and I forced myself to laugh because I didn't want my young client, a white child who had been prosecuted as an adult, to be disadvantaged. But I was disheartened by the experience," he said. "Of course, innocent mistakes occur, but constantly being underestimated, suspected, accused, watched, doubted, distrusted, presumed guilty, and even feared is a burden borne by people of color that can't be understood or confronted without a deeper conversation on our history of racial justice," he said. The prison system, the wealth gap, the health gap, the reaction that I had to my classmate on the soccer field can be understood only by examining our history, by becoming conscious of the legacy that we've inherited that began with the arrival of the first kidnapped Africans on these shores, by reading articles like the New York Times 1619 Project or books like Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. We need our heads for this work. But anyone that's frustrated by the endless book clubs about white fragility knows that we also need to work for change. We need action. We need our hands, and there are abundant ways. At the Urban Ministry, some of the ways that we address the racial wealth gap is by highlighting Black-owned businesses in Roxbury. We make commercials about these businesses and we post them on our community conversation webinars. And we encourage you congregations to support these entrepreneurs. We launched the Roxbury Artist Amplification Project, showcasing artists of color through video galleries, and we produced a catalog of their work, encouraging UUs to purchase from it. We connect UUs from our member congregations with partner organizations in Roxbury that are fighting for racial justice. or those that are working to resist the displacement that is caused by gentrification, those working for environmental justice in communities of color and for educational equity. We need our hands, we need action. But even that isn't enough. We also need our hearts to be in this. We need relationships across difference because relationships are the catalyst for real change. An awakened heart stays the course. Nearly 2 years ago, police killed an unarmed African-American man named George Floyd, and it was a death that reignited the Black Lives Matter movement across the world. UU congregations like this one gathered in the midst of the COVID shutdown to march and demand change. The flames of that movement continue to burn for justice, but we need to ensure that they don't dim. And it's relationships, our hearts, that ensure that. Love makes us steadfast. Love holds us accountable. Love gives us the courage to do hard things. The African-American minister and historian, the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, in one of his sermons tells of how the white clergy came to join Martin Luther King in Selma more than 50 years ago. UUs like the Reverend James Reeb, Orloff Miller, Clark Olson, and Jack Kent. These individuals, Morrison Reed writes, came to Selma not because of what they knew about segregation. It was because of the relationships they had. Reverend James Reeb, who was killed by white supremacists during his visit, lived in Dorchester, where his children attended predominantly Black public schools and where he was immersed in the grassroots empowerment of his African-American neighbors. He knew Black people. Morrison Reed writes, "Today we assume that the outpouring of support and the rush to Selma was because of the righteousness of the cause and magnitude of the injustice, but that doesn't fully explain the response," he wrote. Of course it was because of the cause, but it was relationships that compelled them to go, the connection of one person to another. And here is our problem. Few places are harder to make a connection across race than in Greater Boston. According to the Boston Magazine article, How Has Boston Gotten Away with Being So Segregated for So Long? Of 51 metro areas with significant African-American populations, we're the 15th most segregated. 2/3 of Boston's Black population lives in Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, and hardly any Black people live in the suburbs, and that's by design. The article spells out in excruciating detail all the systems that for the past 100 years have ensured home ownership and therefore wealth creation was kept out of the hands of Black people, and how those systems created a chasm between white people and Black people and prevented us from knowing one another, even into 2022. Segregation may not be the law of the land in Greater Boston, but we can look around and we know it's a fact of Greater Boston. Over the past century, covenant restrictions and subdivisions and redlining and racist FHA policies and racist HUD policies kept Black people out of certain Boston neighborhoods and absolutely out of the suburbs. Here are some examples from the article. In the early 1900s, the first subdivision in Brookline included a racially restricted covenant, which meant basically that homes could not be sold to Black people. Eventually, the National Association of Real Estate Boards, whose code of ethics discouraged members from introducing Black people into white neighborhoods, drafted model covenants like Brookline's and encouraged homeowners associations to adopt them. The FHA was formed in the 1930s, and between 1934 and 1962 spent $120 billion on home loans, 98% of which went to white families. These loans were the driver of the exodus from Boston out to the suburbs for white people. According to the article, quote, "Because the FHA believed that property values would diminish if Black people moved into neighborhoods, Its underwriting manual provided a guideline stating that property shall continue to be occupied by the same social and racial classes. The agency routinely declined to insure developments that weren't exclusively white. By 1970, Boston's suburbs, except for Cambridge, were 98% white. Meanwhile, as white families moved to the suburbs, Black families migrated from the South to Boston and found that the only places that they could live were places like Roxbury, a neighborhood where housing was older and which became ripe picking for slumlords. A Brown University researcher was quoted saying, "So the concept of a Black neighborhood as a bad neighborhood comes right out of this process." And thus, we have the story of the bad neighborhood of Roxbury. Brian Stevenson says that to make real change, privileged people need to get proximate to those who are not privileged. He writes, "To make a difference in creating a healthier community, a healthier society, a healthier nation, we've got to find a way to get proximate to the poor and the vulnerable." He continued, "I absolutely believe that when we isolate ourselves, when we allow ourselves to be shielded and disconnected from those who are vulnerable and disfavored, we sustain and contribute to these problems. I'm persuaded," he said, "that in proximity, there is something that we can learn about how to change the world," end quote. The fact of our segregation makes that hard to do. And when we are not proximate, when we do not feel personally connected to those being disproportionately arrested, incarcerated, killed in police incidents, when we are not connected to the neighborhood suffering environmental pollution or displacement by gentrification, let's be honest, it is easier to set it all aside, to put this movement ignited by the death of George Floyd back on the shelf, to reduce it to a fading bumper sticker or tattered yard sign. And as a woman who's white, I'm not immune. So here's what helps keep me going. I told you the story of my soccer field revelation, and I want to tell you another story about the gift of proximity. And before I became a minister, I was a newspaper reporter in upstate New York. And my cubicle neighbor in the features department was an African-American woman whose newsroom friends included two other African-American women. These colleagues gathered daily at the desk of my neighbor, chatting, joking, sharing stories that I got to hear and become part of. And that dailiness built among us some knowing and some trust. I was then newly vegan and an animal rights activist, and I was assigned a feature story that would mean posting a veal recipe. And after agonizing about it, I said, no, my conscience wouldn't let me. My editors insisted, threatening to fire me if I didn't relent, and my fate hung in the balance. As I recall it 25 years later, 3 people rallied around me, none of them vegan. They were these 3 African-American women, all young, without power in the newsroom hierarchy, but they offered to start a petition to defend me. They were willing to put themselves at risk to defend my right of conscience. In a sea of colleagues, most everyone else stepped back. The ones who stepped forward were these 3 women. They had no interest in animal rights, but they had every interest in standing up for the underdog. And unlike many of my white colleagues, apparently, they did not assume that those in power were right. I learned a lot from this time, and my friendship with these women endured long after I'd left journalism for ministry. I'll never forget the gift of proximity of a simple seating arrangement. It's a gift that I continue to receive daily at the urban ministry. Most of our staff are people of color from the communities we serve. So are our program participants, and so are our neighbors. I'm gifted daily by proximity. At the urban ministry, we think a lot about how to build proximity between member congregations in our neighborhood, not proximity by charity, but how we create space for relationships built upon listening, learning, trust, respect. These are built over time and with intention. There's a quotation on the wall, on the urban ministry wall, when you come inside by the Aboriginal activist, Lila Watson, and it says this: "If you have come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." That is what guides us. That's what we seek. We seek not to help Roxbury. We seek to learn from Roxbury and to build bridges between suburb and city so that together we can make change. We organize tours to Black businesses and historic tours of the neighborhood. We gather committees and task forces made up of UUs and our neighbors to shape our work. This autumn, I spent a chilly morning in Roxbury at an event honoring the elders of our neighborhood who protected and defended the community against racist neglect through the years. The urban ministry had joined a coalition honoring them through a portrait. I felt deep gratitude for the opportunity that I've had to come to know some of these elders, to listen to them, to build relationships. These relationships set my heart on justice for the long haul. Every day we seek ways to introduce, to knit together, to overcome the ways the world has divided us so that we can forge relationships that will help us make the real change that we seek. There's no magic wand for relationship building, just time, intention, trying again and trying again, showing up, listening, learning, and listening more. And so my invitation is this: to continue to do the great work that I know that you do in this congregation for justice and within Cambridge. And if you feel called to also connect with the work of the urban ministry that we're doing in Roxbury, to join our mailing list, to reach out for a conversation with our engagement team, to talk with your urban ministry delegate, Cushing Geisey, for information about how to be involved. Reach out to imagine the gifts that you can bring to the work of keeping the fires for racial justice burning, burning, and burning bright. Thank you and many blessings. Stay safe and well, and amen.